Good day, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's presentation on reforming GRAS, what FDA's new agenda means for food ingredient regulation. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to providing you with information and guidance regarding FDA's new stance on how food ingredients are to be regulated in the U.S. I'm Christina Clemens, Senior Regulatory Specialist and Manager of the Product Labeling and Ingredient Review team, and I'm pleased to be moderating our session today. I'm proud to introduce Anna Benavente, Registrar Corp's Director of Product Labeling and Ingredient Review, who will be leading this webinar. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Biology from the College of William & Mary and has over 15 years of experience in analytical research. Since joining Registrar Corp in 2009, her team has reviewed over 13,000 products for FDA compliance. Throughout this webinar, feel free to write any questions in the Q&A box, and we've saved time at the end to answer them. We'll also follow up with a link to the recording so you can refer back to this at any time. Without further ado, Anna, take it away.
Thanks, Christina, for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be presenting to you all today regarding recent moves made by FDA to change the manner in which ingredients are regulated in the U.S. There's been quite a flurry of activity by FDA in recent months, so we'll talk through exactly what is happening and how it will impact your firms. To get us all on the same page, we'll start with a quick introduction on how ingredients are currently regulated and what the different categories are. Then we'll move into discussions about GRAS notification program that is currently in effect. Then we will pivot to the latest policy changes being implemented by FDA and revised approaches under the new administration. They are extremely drastic, so we'll go over what this means for industry and what sorts of timeframes we're talking about. Finally, we'll present to you Registrar Corp's solutions for companies needing guidance through this new maze of regulations and uncertainty. We'll finish with a question and answer period and address as many of them as we can. Please be sure to add them to the Q&A box in your screen, not the chat, and please don't raise your hands, but use that Q&A box and we'll get to them as many of them as we can. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Registrar Corp, we are a firm that specializes in FDA regulatory compliance with over 30,000 clients across 175 countries. We have 20 offices worldwide to assist our clients in their time zones and languages. We are very proud to have a high level of satisfaction from our clients and over 20 years of service to companies in the food, supplement, cosmetic, drug, and device industries. Our label review team of experienced professionals hold multiple advanced degrees in the areas of biology, chemistry, quality management, botany, human nutrition, and cosmetic sciences. And as mentioned before, we have reviewed over 13,000 products for compliance and take enormous pride in ensuring that our clients meet FDA's requirements for food formulation and labeling. So let's begin with some basics about how food ingredients are regulated in the U.S. We'll go over the terminology that FDA uses to describe these different substances that are added to food, as these terms will dictate which regulatory requirements will apply. Now, before we begin, let's start with a quick history lesson regarding the legislation around food ingredients. Around the turn of the 20th century, prompted by concerns related to the quality and safety of foods, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906 to address the rampant adulteration of foods being sold in the U.S. It increased the authority of the government to take action against fraudulent and dangerous products, but it was still somewhat limited in scope. The passage of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act in 1938 further expanded FDA's authority and importantly included requirements for food standards and for colors to be approved before they could be used in foods. The safety of additives began to be targeted in the 1950s, resulting in the passage of the Food Additives Amendment, which required manufacturers of new food additives to establish their safety with FDA before marketing through the Food Additive Petition process and obtain actual approval from the agency. These food additives were ingredients with no previous history of safety, So substances that were generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, were excluded from this definition. In the years that followed, FDA amended their regulations and published their first list of nearly 200 GRAS substances. In 1960, the Color Additives Amendment formalized the requirement for manufacturers to establish the safety of colors prior to their use in food and provisionally listed them in the Code of Federal Regulations. FDA has been permanently listing them since for those that have scientific data to support their use. Food regulation was further energized in 1969 when then President Nixon directed FDA to further examine the safety of GRAS substances, resulting in the Select Committee of GRAS Substances and rulemaking to affirm those deemed to be GRAS and put them on the agency's list, or those that were subject of an industry petition. However, rulemaking is quite time-consuming and a burden on resources. To address this, FDA moved to a GRAS notification program under a proposed rule in 1997, which was then later finalized in 2018. This program allowed industry to notify the agency that certain substances were GRAS. FDA would then state either that the agency had no questions regarding this assertion, or they would state that they did not agree that the GRAS conclusion was warranted. Now, 2025 has ushered in a new administration under President Trump and almost immediately began making announcements related to this system and their plans for change. Specifically, the GRAS system was highlighted as needing change and the administration's intent to tighten scrutiny over ingredients being used in food. So to understand how all of this will unfold, it's important to understand the current regulatory framework. It results in three primary classifications for ingredients: food additives, GRAS substances, and color additives. Now, by law, all substances added to food must be approved by FDA unless they are generally recognized as safe. The responsibility lies with industry to submit a food additive petition to FDA with data to support the safety for the substance's use in food. There are also substances deemed prior sanctioned as they were approved by FDA prior to 1958. Color additives, even those from natural sources, must all be approved by FDA. They are never considered GRAS. They will require submission of a color additive petition by industry to support the safety of their use in food. Now, GRAS substances are those generally recognized as safe for their intended use. They are excluded from the definition of a food additive and therefore not subject to those approval requirements. So any substance that is not GRAS is automatically considered a food additive and subject to approval. The food additive petition would be filed usually by the manufacturer with the Office of Food Additive Safety and is a pretty substantial undertaking. So the petition normally consists of these 9 sections. Our first one, additive identity and composition. The submitter would provide the name, chemical identity, composition, physical, chemical, or biological properties, specifics regarding manufacturing methods, impurities and byproducts for the substance. Also, if applicable, stability data and expiration dating might be included in this submission. Our second part would be the manufacturing details themselves. The submitter would list all substances and proprietary preparations that are used in production, including all of those that are undergoing chemical change. They would also identify all parties involved in the manufacturing, processing, and packing. Proposed use and labeling would also be included and would include the amount and purpose of the use, directions and recommendations, draft labeling, and any labeling that would be required on the finished food containing the substance, so such as the phenylalanine warning on aspartame. Effectiveness data, of course, is going to be part of this submission, and it would demonstrate the additive's intended physical, or technical effects, and the amounts needed to achieve it. And the submitter would also describe the practical methods for detecting the additive and any resulting substances that occur in the food using these analytical methods that are part of number 5. Naturally, safety data is importantly going to be part of this submission. So the notifier would provide full reports of safety investigations, including animal and biological studies, with explanations for any omitted data. Tolerances and regulations are also going to be included in the submission. So any proposed tolerance levels, if needed for safety, would be included, as well as any proposed regulatory language, such as the limits for the addition of folic acid in foods, this sort of thing. Now, if there are cases where the substance has already been approved for a different use, then any modifications to the regulations would be identified. So you would detail all the proposed changes and then submit a supplemental petition for changes that go beyond the original scope of the approval. And then finally, environmental impact. You must submit either a claim for a categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment per the applicable regulations. So you can see that the data requirements for a food additive petition are quite extensive. Companies must have comprehensive information related to the substance in order to get it approved for addition to food. Now, as we mentioned on the previous slide, color additives also must go through a color additive petition process, which may require similar data to support its use in food. So that leaves us with GRAS substances. What are they exactly? Well, by definition, they are substances that are recognized among qualified experts as having been adequately shown through scientific procedures, or in the case of a substance used in food prior to January 1st, 1958, through experience based on common use in food. So it would be shown to be safe under these conditions of their intended use. So the first subcategory of sorts are those that are GRAS under scientific procedures. That there exists scientific data, either private or public, that when applied, establishes the safety of the substance under its conditions of use. Now, the second subcategory would be those substances that have a history of common use in food by a significant number of consumers. Now, importantly, the definition cites qualified experts recognizing GRAS status. So these would be individuals qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate the safety of substances for their intended use. Now, this is not limited to FDA reviewers and scientists. And so this has a monumental impact on how this status is utilized by industry. So how is GRAS status then determined and designated? There are 3 primary ways that an ingredient might be designated as GRAS. Some have been affirmed as GRAS by FDA. Many went through the rulemaking process that established regulations in parts 182, 184, and 186 of our Code of Federal Regulations. There are also reports from the Select Committee on GRAS Substances that discusses the GRAS status for about 380 ingredients. Now, some other substances have gone through the GRAS notification program. In this case, a company would have filed a GRAS notice asserting GRAS status. FDA began this program to replace the affirmation rulemaking, which was burdensome and slow and required a lot of the agency's resources. There are over 1,200 GRAS notices currently on file with FDA. Then lastly, some companies will self-affirm that substances are GRAS for their intended use. FDA has stated that this is permitted. A company can independently conclude that a substance is GRAS without informing FDA. They should follow the same data requirements as a GRAS notice and convene a GRAS panel of experts to perform this evaluation. So now let's do a deeper dive into the GRAS notification program and discuss what it is and why it's being criticized. The program allows for a notice to be voluntarily submitted to FDA's Office of Food Additive Safety. This will inform FDA of a GRAS determination for a substance used in food. The notifier is the person responsible for the notice, which may be an individual, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity. Now, it may be submitted by the manufacturer, or it may be submitted by a different third party on behalf of the notifier, such as an attorney or a different third party, such as a qualified expert. It's common to see consultants and attorneys filing these on behalf of manufacturers, but it's not actually required. There are 7 mandatory parts that must be included as specified in regulation. You may also send timely amendments after the initial submission, but before a decision is rendered. FDA will respond within 180 days of filing, but may extend an additional 90 days if warranted. It's important to know that the notice will be included in a public inventory, along with any letter of decision that's been issued by the FDA. Also, you may request cessation of the evaluation at any time before FDA's response, but understand that this request is also part of the public inventory and can be seen by consumers, competitors, or just about anyone else. Now, similar to a food additive petition, the GRAS notice will involve quite a bit of information, all mandated by the regulation that governs the program. Part 1 is related to statements and certification for the identity of the notifier and the substance. So to include clarification of the basis for GRAS status. In other words, is it based on scientific procedures or on common use in food? And the conditions of use for the substance. Part 2 will provide data and information for the substance itself, such as a CAS number, descriptions of manufacturing processes, and any other data for physical and technical effects. Part 3 requires data to show the overall dietary exposure to the consumer from use of the substance, but also including other sources in the diet based on verifiable consumption data. Part 4 will include any maximum levels at which it can be added to food due to palatability or technology limitations. Now, if you're using common use in food as your basis, you will need to compile evidence to support the history of consumption prior to 1958. This is Part 5 of the submission. Part 6 will begin the conclusion portion of your submission. You will explain why the data presented provides a basis for safety under the conditions of its use, and whether this data is generally available. It should also address any conflicting data. Lastly, a list of the data and information must be presented, including whether it is generally available or privately held. Now, once submitted, FDA will review the information and respond in one of 3 ways. 1, that they have no questions regarding the notifier's conclusion that the substance is GRAS. However, they will include a statement that they themselves have not conducted their own evaluation that the substance is GRAS. They're merely stating that they have no questions regarding the notifier's assertion and data that the substance is GRAS. 2, they will state that the notice does not provide this basis for GRAS determination. Or 3, if the notifier has requested that FDA cease to evaluate the submission, that will appear in the public GRAS notice inventory. Now, if they had no questions, you're good to go ahead and mark it. If you requested cessation of the evaluation, you are still kind of okay to go ahead and market it. But if FDA responded that your data was not sufficient to support a GRAS conclusion, it may be considered an unapproved food additive, and any product including it may be considered adulterated. So now we turn to our mysterious third option, self-affirming. What is involved with this, and why is it allowed? It's allowed because FDA is not the sole qualified expert to determine a GRAS status. The law mentions qualified experts as being people with scientific training and experience to evaluate the safety of substances, not just FDA scientists and reviewers. So a company may self-affirm that an ingredient is GRAS. In fact, the final rule for the GRAS notification program says that there is no distinction between a conclusion submitted as a GRAS notice and one conducted independently by a company itself. However, FDA strongly recommends that these independent conclusions have the same information found in parts 1 through 7 that we just discussed. So why do companies self-affirm? Well, FDA's public inventory allows their competitors to see product composition and manufacturing process data. And so while you can redact portions of your submission, much of the information can be accessed easily. There may also be concerns about FDA's timeline and delays, although you may market while FDA is reviewing your submission. And despite all this, many companies do want the certainty that comes with an FDA response to a GRAS notice. Large retailers and brand owners may feel more comfortable knowing that FDA has provided a positive response to mitigate any liability that they could bear. So some advocacy groups have criticized both the notification program and the ability to self-affirm. Many of the concerns center on evasion of oversight by FDA. They state that the system was originally intended to apply GRAS status to widely known ingredients such as vinegar, but is being used by industry to evade FDA review of novel ingredients and those with unknown safety risks. They accuse GRAS of being a regulatory loophole that lets companies add new, potentially harmful additives to the food supply without any safety review by FDA, whenever a company has self-affirmed the substance. Critics claim companies use it to avoid the rigorous food additive petition process and put public health at risk. So in fact, a 2014 National Resources Defense Council report called it generally recognized as secret. Critics further claim that a vast majority of the new ingredients are self-affirmed rather than being subjected to FDA scrutiny. There are many criticisms of the GRAS notification program as well. GRAS in general has been called a broken process by organizations such as the Environmental Working Group that was further weakened by a notification program that was voluntary and not required. Also, companies may voluntarily request cessation and cancellation of the review. Critics accuse these companies of doing so when FDA starts asking questions about the safety data. Moreover, when a notice is withdrawn, FDA does not state what concerns may have prompted the company to request cancellation and withdrawal, and it doesn't prevent the company from continuing to market the product. So without a letter stating that the data was not supportive of GRAS status, companies can remain free to market the substance without oversight. Now, many of these companies have concerns about the abilities for self-affirmation, concerned that self-affirmation by independent contractors sidesteps FDA's review. There's a question of whether an expert panel is actually conducting the review, or if companies are not verifying safety as necessary. They cite a conflict of interest when companies use their own employees to do evaluations, and that financial pressures may compel companies to cut short the evaluations and rush to market. The core tenet of GRAS is that the substance is, quote, generally recognized, unquote, as safe. And to be so, its identity, chemical composition, and the safety determination must be publicly disclosed, which self-affirmed substances are not. There is no list of substances that companies have self-affirmed, so consumers do not have a way to know if the ingredients in their foods have been reviewed by FDA or not. So ultimately, critics claim that our current system allows untested ingredients into the marketplace and undermines the public trust in the safety of our food. Which leads us to the changes we're seeing unfolding this year. Is there a new tide turning at FDA? We see the potential for major shifts in ingredient regulation on the horizon. 2025 has marked a dramatic shift with heightened emphasis on the regulation of food ingredients by the new Trump administration. With the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees FDA, we see a new focus on ingredients that are permitted in the U.S. food supply. Part of the Trump campaign platform, heavily influenced by Kennedy's positions, was to, quote, make America healthy again, unquote. Their stated mission is to address the root causes of chronic disease and promote wellness. RFK Jr. was very vocal in his criticisms of the U.S. food system and the ingredient approval process as well. His concerns center on the prevalence of synthetic food additives and his stance that they are marketed without knowing whether they are safe for human consumption. Now, there's been quite a bit of activity recently regarding food additives, particularly color additives. While they are never considered GRAS and must be approved by FDA, these actions give us a really good indication of this administration's priorities. It actually began late last year under the Biden administration, when FD&C Red No. 3 was banned, with a compliance date of January 2027 for food products. Since then, the Trump administration has requested that industry voluntarily remove Red No. 3 ahead of that deadline and has taken significant additional actions. They have announced the planned revocation of the approval of Citrus Red No. 2 and Orange V, two synthetic color additives that are approved but seldom used. The administration announced an initiative to push for voluntary phase-out by industry of all other synthetic approved color additives by the end of 2026. This would include common color additives such as FD&C Red No. 40, Yellow No. 5, and Blue No. 1. Now, there was some skepticism, including by me, that industry would comply. But then on January 17th, Kraft announced their plan to remove all synthetic colors by the end of 2027. And others have followed since. Nestle, Conagra, Smuckers, and General Mills have all made similar announcements in the last few weeks. And to encourage the use of natural colors, FDA has approved 3 new naturally sourced color additives: calcium phosphate, Galdiaria extract blue, and then added new approvals for butterfly pea flower extract. Now, the GRAS system is also on their radar and has been targeted for significant changes. Sorry, I'm having a problem moving slides. All right, sorry everyone. I have an issue with the slides right now. They don't seem to want to advance. Pardon the technical issues. Okay, I think we got it. There we go. Apologies, everyone. Okay, so the new administration did not waste any time in addressing the GRAS process of ingredient regulation and other issues related to their safety. In February, an executive order established a MAHA commission seeking to improve the health of Americans. In March, FDA announced plans to explore rulemaking to remove the self-affirmation pathway entirely. More on this in just a minute. They also published the Chemical Contaminants Transparency Tool, an online searchable database providing a consolidated list of contaminant levels, such as tolerances, action levels, and guidance levels, that are then used to evaluate potential health risks of contaminants in human foods. In May, FDA announced a post-market review of food chemicals already in the market, with a focus on those that concern consumers the most, such as propylparaben. Then in June, FDA published a proposed tool for determining which chemicals would be prioritized for post-market assessment for safety targeting those with the greatest level of potential health risk to the public. So industry is left wondering what the next steps may be, as the administration has clearly focused on this matter. Now, the most groundbreaking or disruptive, depending on your viewpoint, is the stated intent to eliminate self-affirmation as a means to establish GRAS status for an ingredient. FDA has announced plans to explore potential rulemaking to revise the GRAS final rule and to work with Congress to explore ways that legislation can close what they call the GRAS loophole. Kennedy has asserted that companies exploit this loophole to allow new chemicals with unknown safety data into the U.S. marketplace with no notification to FDA or the public. Elimination of this pathway would force companies to notify FDA and provide data to support an ingredient's safety. Their opinion is that this elimination of the pathway will result in greater transparency for the consumer and increased public health. So as we say, the elephant in the room is exactly how might FDA move to accomplish this? So even though they seem all-powerful, FDA cannot simply eliminate a process that is stipulated in the law or regulation. Even if they altered the current rule or issued a new rule, if it contradicts what is in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it could, and likely would, be challenged in court. Last year, the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron deference decision, which required courts to uphold a federal agency's interpretation of the law if Congress had not directly addressed it. This takes the power of interpreting the law away from the federal agencies and places it back with the courts. So this could stall attempts to eliminate the pathway. So perhaps the administration will try to convince Congress to change the law, eliminating the option of self-affirmation by industry. The real question would be is if there is support with slim Republican majorities in the House and Senate to push through something of this magnitude. So another option, which may not require a change to the law, could be to require companies to publicly notify when they have self-affirmed a substance's GRAS. This could increase transparency to the public regarding the ingredients that have not been reviewed by FDA. FDA could also issue guidance documents specifying their desire to have companies submit notices and cease self-affirmation, but these are non-binding and could have little impact. However, as we've noticed with the synthetic color additives and companies voluntarily complying with the phase-out, industry may not be as reticent as we might assume regarding filing GRAS notices. The administration could take a similar approach and request companies voluntarily submit notifications for any substances that they've self-affirmed as GRAS. This could result in hundreds, though, if not thousands of filings. And as always, there's a question of FDA resources being sufficient, especially in light of recent cuts to FDA staff. So what does this mean for industry? There are lots of different pathways that FDA could take, and FDA has not specifically stated what their next actions exactly will be. So how can a company prepare now with an uncertain future lying ahead? Well, before everybody starts to panic, I do want to assure you that any permanent changes will take time. The reason that FDA asked for voluntary removal of synthetic colors by industry is because rulemaking takes years, especially for new regulations that would drastically alter the regulatory landscape. We have a system called notice and commentary, where thankfully the government must notify the public of any proposed changes to regulations and allow time for comment by us ordinary Americans. So this is the pathway that it often follows. Advance notice is published, and it must allow for public comment, followed by a proposed rule with more time for comment, and then a final rule where the agency must address the comments that were submitted and justify when changes were or were not made. Now, once issued, there is usually a significant time period allowed for industry to come into compliance, usually a year or sometimes many more, depending on the magnitude of the changes. So it is unlikely that FDA could take immediate action to eliminate the self-affirmation pathway, but you should still prepare for changes. It's difficult to know exactly what approach FDA might take, but there are some steps that you can take now in order to be prepared for even the most drastic changes. You absolutely should conduct an internal audit of all of the products that you manufacture or distribute. Figure out what ingredients are in your portfolio so that you can take the next step to evaluate each ingredient to determine what its status is. For those classified as food or color additives, make sure that your use conforms to the regulation. Some are approved generally in food, but many have strict limits on the types of products to which they can be added or the levels at which they can be added. For those not covered by a food or color additive regulation, they must have some sort of GRAS status to be legally marketed. Research whether there is a GRAS affirmation and regulation, or if a GRAS notice has ever been submitted that corresponds to your use as well. Now note, though, that even if there is a GRAS notice that is similar to your use of the substance, you will still want to independently verify that your use of the substance is GRAS. If you have self-affirmed a substance is GRAS, ensure that the data supports this conclusion. If there are any shortcomings or omissions, or if your dossier doesn't include the parts that FDA specifies for a GRAS notice, it would be wise to convene a GRAS panel and immediately address those weaknesses or omissions. Companies should strongly consider submitting a GRAS notice or food additive petition if that is more appropriate to the FDA. It can mitigate any undue scrutiny that you might experience from FDA if you can show that the data supports your conclusion that your use of a certain ingredient is appropriate. GRAS notices are submitted using Form 3667 and can be filed electronically. There is also guidance available from FDA for best practices in convening GRAS expert panels. Sorry, a few more issues with the slides. Apologies, everybody. Okay, thank you so much for your time today, and we hope that you found the information helpful as to what potential actions FDA could take and then how to prepare for them. We'd like to take a few moments to go over some of the solutions that Registrar Corp offers to assist companies with FDA regulatory requirements. Now, as part of your internal audit for your products and ingredients, you will need to confirm that your ingredients are acceptable, either approved as food or color additives, or are considered GRAS. Our ingredient review service will research the regulatory status of each ingredient in your product formulation. We'll help you identify which are clearly approved as food additives or are GRAS, and which may require self-affirmation or submission of a GRAS notice. You'll receive one-on-one assistance from an experienced regulatory specialist, and our reports go through a 3-tiered peer review system. The report gives you the details for each ingredient, whether its permitted uses apply to your product specifically, whether it's a food additive, color additive, or GRAS substance, and will provide the regulatory citations for your records to support your conclusion that the ingredient is acceptable. We also offer custom consulting on any number of matters related to FDA regulation and enforcement. You can harness our expertise to solve your most complex product challenges. We can offer you subject matter expertise tailored to your exact needs for however long you need it. Partner with us to ensure that your products meet FDA's requirements. We have many other ways that we can help you as you market your foods in the U.S. Registrar Corp offers a full range of compliance services, all of which are fixed fee. We can assist you with many FDA requirements, such as food facility registration and U.S. agent, prior notice, labeling, requirements for low acid and canned foods, food safety plans, and services to meet the requirements of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. We can also help you if your products are being detained or are on import alert. If you get detained, don't give up right away. Send us the FDA's notice of action for a free assessment, and we can see if and how you may be able to get them released. We look forward to assisting you with successful distribution of your products to the U.S. market.
Thank you, Anna. And with that, we can now open it up to questions. Please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box so that we can address them right away. Additionally, to help us enhance future webinars, we'd greatly appreciate your feedback through taking a quick 30-second survey that will be provided to you. So now we'll start with the first question. So is there a minimum number of experts when it comes to GRAS affirmation?
So it may depend on the technical expertise of the experts that you've added to your panel. I strongly recommend anybody who is convening a GRAS expert panel to check out the guidance. It's recent guidance that was issued by FDA. You can find it very easily on the FDA website, www.fda.gov. And so it will give you all of their recommendations for best practices so that you can ensure if FDA comes a calling and inquiring that you can show that you met all of the requirements that they specified in that guidance. So certainly take a look at that. It's extraordinarily helpful to make sure that you're going to be meeting what the regulation demands.
All right, thank you. So next question, if an ingredient is sold in the U.S. market for years now based on self-affirmed GRAS, is there a risk its status will be revoked if the pathway is canceled?
There is always a risk. As I mentioned, those new tools were coming out recently related to the GRAS pathway. They are pretty hyper-focused on the GRAS status and the self-affirmation pathway. So it would certainly behoove a company to go and look and see what sort of analysis was done prior to marketing the product. Even if it was years ago, hopefully your company records can yield some sort of information regarding an assessment before it was added to food. If you don't have data to support it, even if you've been selling it for years, it may be prudent to go ahead and convene a GRAS panel just to make sure that the data supports the GRAS conclusion, especially in light of how much these substances are under scrutiny right now. If it's something where it was self-affirmed based on common use in food, if it's kind of a quote unquote normal ingredient, like a vinegar of sorts or something, then you're probably fine. But if it is something that's relatively novel, then I think convening a GRAS panel is probably in your best interest.
All right, thank you. And then we have someone asking if there's a list of approved ingredients and how do I know if my products meet those guidelines?
Okay, so for all three of the categories, certain ones are in regulations. So if you go to the Code of Federal Regulations for the U.S., there's in 172 and 173, you'll find the approved food additives. And so some of them will have their own regulations. Some of them, like coatings for fruits, are grouped together in a single regulation. But within those, and then the GRAS affirmations, which as I mentioned are in 182, 184, and 186, in essence, the regulations are very well written in that they identify the substance. A lot of times they'll give different specifications for impurities or contaminants, like levels of arsenic and that sort of thing. And then also they'll specify the intended use. So they'll tell you whether or not it's either approved generally for use in food, which a lot of them are, or in some cases, like polysorbate 80 is kind of my favorite example to kind of illustrate how complex some of these regulations can be. It has a very specific and limited and large list of types of products into which it can be added. So things like color fixative for barbecue sauce and that sort of thing. And it may, like in some cases, like with titanium dioxide, it'll tell you, oh, it can only be used up to a level of 1% in food. So accessing the regulations is is pivotal to really understanding whether or not your use of that substance is going to meet the requirements and regulations. So again, the food additive approvals, the color additive approvals, and then the actual GRAS affirmations are going to be found in our Code of Federal Regulations. The public inventory for GRAS notices that were submitted by industry can also be found on the FDA's webpage as well.
All right, fantastic. And then kind of to segue talking about those intended uses, we have a question here asking about a rinse/cleaning step that's a food additive on raw fruit and whether or not that would be subject to GRAS regulations, and also if it must be declared on a label.
Okay, so substances like that often are considered secondary direct food additives. And so there is a regulation for chemicals that are used in the washing and peeling of fruits and vegetables that you'll want to access to see whether or not your substances are listed in that food additive approval. Generally speaking, they're considered incidental additives or processing aids, and so they usually are not going to actually be declared on a label, though, in the ingredients list. That's usually limited to the primary direct food additives, things that are actually intentionally added as ingredients to a food.
All right, thank you. And then segueing to talk a little bit about color additives. So one person is wondering about color additives that are added to fish food.
Okay, yes, excellent question. Very interesting nuance to the color additive regulation. So if you are, for example, producing aquaculture salmon or seafood of some sort, and you are adding a color to the fish feed that is intended to then impart color to the flesh of the animal. So astaxanthin is a good example of something that's added to salmon feed to make the flesh appear more pink. That is actually considered a color additive because, of course, the salmon doesn't care what color his food is, but the intended use is to then color the flesh that then is consumed by, the human consumer. And so they are regulated and usually declared in the ingredients list also in some way, shape, or form as being added to that particular food. Another good example is with marigold extract that's sometimes added to chicken feed. So that results in a more yellow tone to the skin and then to the yolk of the eggs. And so that's also being regulated as a color additive because it ends up in human food.
All right, great. So next question. So this is a person wondering if FDA is transparent at all about how they prioritize GRAS submissions coming in, and also wondering if we have a pre-1958 use, would they still need to make a submission?
Okay, so for a pre-1958 use, depending on whether it's, and again, FDA is going to prioritize kind of the novel ingredients. So if you're concerned about something like monosodium glutamate, which is just sort of generally recognized as safe and has been around for decades and is actually cited as a GRAS substance, even though it doesn't have its own regulation by FDA, those types of foods, you probably don't have to worry about them being, the first to be targeted by FDA. They produce that tool that's going to help them determine what sort of substances potentially have the greatest safety risks, and they're going to focus their attention on those. As far as the GRAS notices go, our understanding is that they're dealt with in the order in which they're received. So if you do have one that is novel and you have, especially if you already have the data to support, robust data to support a GRAS conclusion, it may be in your best interest to go ahead and file it now and get a response from FDA so that, you can kind of get it in before they start taking action where maybe there could end up be a flood. Now, also know though that, even if you get caught up in the flood, of GRAS notices that might be submitted, you are still permitted to market it even as your GRAS notice is under review. And so, if you miss that early phase, then you still are okay to market it. But once the FDA renders a decision, if they don't support your conclusion, then you may need to remove it from the marketplace or file a food additive petition.
All right, thank you. Is it mandatory to have a DUN number?
A DUNS number?
Yeah.
Okay, so sounds like it's related to the food facility registration requirement. And so for food facility registrations, there is a new, relatively new, like within the last couple of years, requirement for a unique identifier. My understanding at this point is that the DUNS number is the only one that's been recognized by FDA. The challenge here is that the DUNS number is issued by Dun& Bradstreet, which is a private company, and sometimes it can take a while to get one. And as we've also discovered, because we have a very extensive food facility registration group, what we've discovered is that you do need to make sure that your food facility registration matches what Dun& Bradstreet has in their records for you. Because if they don't match up, even if it's something silly, like you've abbreviated street in one and not the other, sometimes the FDA's system will kick it back and say that the DUNS number that you put in doesn't apply. And so that just creates headaches and delays. So you want to make sure that that DUNS number, how your company is listed, the address, et cetera, matches what you've put in your food facility registration as well. And if you need assistance with that, we have a very experienced group. We serve as U.S. agent for something like 18,000 different food companies. So we're very well versed in how to navigate getting the DUNS numbers, and then also filing the food facility registrations and making sure they match up perfectly so you don't encounter those delays.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, next question, going back to food additives. So what information may need to be noted for processing aids in food manufacturing? Is this administration looking at processing aids in addition to food ingredients?
So processing aids are also included in regulation. And so in theory, they are also subject to all of the requirements, that a direct ingredient might as well. So, if you're using or producing processing aids, you'll want to verify their GRAS or food additive status as well. Again, they're not going to be declared on the label, but that doesn't mean that they're exempt from food additive regulation.
All right, thank you. And then a follow-up question regarding GRAS status. So just to make sure I understand correctly, for example, if sodium phosphate is listed under GRAS section in the CFR, that means it's not an additive. Is that correct?
Yes. So the tricky part about the terminology here is that we have to kind of retrain our brains. It's easy to think food additive, anything added, anything that's being added to food, but within regulation and the law, it's got a very limited definition. So you're either going to have your food additives and then your GRAS substances. So if something is listed as a GRAS substance, like as an affirmation, an affirmation regulation in the CFR, that means that it's GRAS and not technically a food additive. Now, to complicate things, there are certain substances that are considered GRAS for one use and a food additive for a different use. So, for example, BHA and BHT have regulations in both sides of the CFR. So they are considered food additives for addition to certain types of foods like cereals and baked goods and things like that. And then they have a GRAS affirmation for use when added to oils as an antioxidant. So, you want to carefully review the regulations to see where your substance appears and what sort of status is designated for it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So if an ingredient has an EU number for food approval, is it approved by the FDA also, or would it need to have a separate approval?
Okay, excellent question. And it's a mistake that unfortunately a lot of people will make, is that they will presume that because in their home country, in their home market, where the ingredients have been approved, particularly something for the EU that has a very robust food safety system, they may presume that that means that it's okay for the US market, but that's not always the case, especially for color additives. But just generally speaking, an approval in a different regulatory market does not automatically mean that it's going to be deemed acceptable by FDA. So you will want to independently verify whether or not your substances have been approved as food additives or color additives or affirmed as GRAS by FDA.
All right, thank you. And then kind of jumping off of that. So if a substance is only recognized as FEMA GRAS, which I assume is for the Flavor Manufacturers Association, would it be necessary to take additional steps to use it as a food ingredient beyond just as flavor?
Excellent question. So yes, the FEMA GRAS is actually that designation is included in FDA's. It used to be called EFIS, everything added to food in the U.S. Now it's called substances added to food. It's a database that FDA has for substances that they are aware have been added to food, and having a FEMA GRAS status is a good thing to have, and if you ever have concerns about that status, you just contact them directly. But I think it's kind of considered an industry standard. But to your point, if you then extend beyond that and use that substance in a different way, the FEMA GRAS status is not going to apply. Because again, GRAS status is actually dependent on the conditions of use. So for example, flavors are often added in very small amounts, or maybe only into certain kinds of food. So if you then take that substance and use it in a completely different way or a completely different product, that GRAS status will not automatically transfer. So you'll want to independently verify that the new use is considered GRAS, or go ahead, file a GRAS notice, get a food added approval, whatever the case may be.
All right, thank you. And then a question about GRAS notifications. So is it best to include clinical studies when submitting for GRAS? Is that important?
So clinical studies aren't cited specifically in the regulation for GRAS notices. So it kind of, I guess it would depend, because it's a sort of an overarching term. It would sort of depend exactly what the nature of the studies were. If they are, in essence, supporting the safety for consumption, then that may well be the case that it could be included. Again, the GRAS notification process itself, if you're not familiar with it, getting a consultant who has experience in developing the dossier that gets submitted to FDA could be very useful. Checking the regulation, which is in Part 170, I believe, that'll tell you exactly what all those different parts are. Again, it's clinical data isn't specifically mentioned, but there is a lot of safety data that has to be part of it. So if that's part of your dossier on the safety side, then it certainly seems like including it could be prudent.
All right, wonderful, thank you. Well, that is all the time we have today. So with that, we will conclude our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you found the information helpful. Please do take the survey that you will receive as we conclude to give us feedback, and please feel free to suggest any additional topics you would like us to cover in future webinars. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.